Lanka. Last time I came here on vacation, I saw the Cultural Triangle, the tea country, Yala, and the beaches. A truly spectacular country. So far, this time it was meant to be a pure vacation until Anil suggested I gave a public speech today and another speech tomorrow. I went to Yala. Very different from when I was here 4 years ago. 4 years ago, it'd been very rainy, very floods. The tanks were full and overflowing. Going down to Yala this week, clearly you've got a major drought that really is a serious problem. But it is a real pleasure to be here today, and I really appreciate you attending this lecture. You've basically heard the message in the introduction. Climate change is indeed a serious issue. Let's see, I'm not sure how these, nothing seems to change anything. Hang on a second. Fine. Okay. This almost is a conclusion of the talk in many ways. There is no doubt human activities, us, are changing the Earth's climate. None at all. Most of the impacts are harmful, especially in developing countries. All countries, rich and poor, small and large, need to transition to a low-carbon economy, and that means not using coal and fossil fuels, but using cost-effective, low-carbon technologies. Wind, solar, modern biomass. There is something called the Paris Agreement that was alluded to in the introduction, where every country in the world has agreed to have pledged to try and reduce greenhouse gases such that we can limit human-induced climate change to 2 degrees Celsius. What I will tell you is those pledges are totally and utterly inadequate. But it is good. It's a first step. That all countries of the world have recognised the need to deal with climate change. And so it's very straightforward. The time for action is now in all countries. We need to mitigate climate change by reducing our emissions of so-called greenhouse gases, and we need to adapt to climate change. This is a collage, as you can see, effectively of newspaper articles literally in the last few days. The middle one says that 700,000 people are being affected by the drought. Yesterday's newspaper put the number at 1 million people being affected by the drought. In the top, the thing called absolute zero, a professor says the trouble is Sri Lanka is not prepared at this moment in time. I'm not sure that anyone will see those slides with the lights on. That's the problem. I mean, the colours will completely merge, to be honest. I don't think the slides will be readable with these lights on. I really would prefer the lights off if at all possible. So, the newspapers have recognised that climate change is an issue, but actually there are a lot of government policies for climate change. Here is just a collage of many of them, and one in the middle is indeed the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy. I read it this morning. It's actually very good. It does recognise the challenge to Sri Lanka of issues such as effects on agriculture, water, human health, sea level rise on coastal communities. I think the challenge now is how to move some of these policies into action. So, what do we know? Very straightforward. The emissions of greenhouse gases are going up. This is the main greenhouse gas that causes climate change, carbon dioxide. It's put in the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, and deforestation. Because quite often with deforestation, the vegetation is burned and carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere. So we know that all over the world, carbon dioxide concentrations are going up. The world claimed in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, we should try and stop human-induced climate change. And as you can see from the middle of the slide, 1990, the concentrations of carbon dioxide have gone up and up and up since we first talked about dealing with the issue. Why have they gone up? This very, very simply shows you the emissions from the fossil fuel industry, and literally all over the globe, the concentration since 1990, when we first said we wanted to deal with climate change, have almost doubled. This actually shows you, if it works properly, but it's not, it doesn't look like it is. Oh yes, it is. This shows you where it first occurred. First occurred in Britain, emitting the Industrial Revolution, quickly spread to Australia, then through parts of Asia, then India, Australia, places that the British colonised, as you can see. Not very proud of that as being an ex-British. But you can see these are the global emissions of carbon dioxide through time. And so while it started in Great Britain, spread to North America, spread to Europe, literally in every part of the world now, we're seeing major emissions of carbon dioxide. It is truly a global issue. Why? Every country in the world uses fossil fuel to produce energy at one level or another. So about 91% of all the carbon dioxide has been put into the atmosphere from energy. But about another 9% from deforestation, mainly from tropical countries. About 44% of that stays in the atmosphere, and that's what's causing the warming and so-called human-induced climate change. Some of it gets reabsorbed in new forested systems, about 31%, and some goes into the ocean, absorbed into the ocean. This is the part that caused climate change. This part down here I'll mention in a few minutes is not good either. As you put carbon dioxide into the ocean, it causes carbonic acid, ocean acidification that's also bad for society. So deforestation, it's a significant cause of climate change, but even more important, or as important, it's a major loss of biodiversity and the ecosystems we all rely on. Deforestation in Sri Lanka will undermine the tourist industry. It will cause landslides, it will cause siltations of the rivers and the lakes. Sri Lanka has signed the biodiversity HE targets. It makes good economic sense to protect the biodiversity. Equally, it makes good economic sense to try and limit human-induced climate change. I chair this thing called the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and it's a scientific body. We don't make policy, we assess what we know and give that information to governments. Sri Lanka has signed as a member, but it never shows up. It never sends any of its experts to our meetings, and I really would plead with the government to try and take their involvement in IPBS a little bit more seriously. And forest systems in particular play a really critical role in mitigating climate change. This is now a very key slide. If you purely look at the black line, the solid black line, this is the temperature over the last number of years, and as you can see, the black line goes up. The black line goes up whether it's the land area, or the land or the ocean area, or what they call the heat content of the ocean. Equally, if you only look at Asia, temperature's going up. The blue line that's relatively flat is, we try to explain, could we explain the observed change in temperature only on natural phenomena? Changes in volcanic activity, changes in solar activity. And as you can see, the blue line does not represent the increase of the black line. So we then said, okay, let's now make a climate model that allows for natural variability, but also allows for the fact we have put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And as you can see, the pink-orange line simulates the black line extremely well. This is just one line of evidence that says we cannot explain the change in climate on natural phenomena. The only way we can explain the recent warming and the changes in precipitation, the changes in sea level, is because of human activity, our emissions of greenhouse gases. This is a very complicated slide, but you don't need to worry about it. What it simply says is, we have seen changes in the physical system, the amount of ice, river flow all over the world. We're seeing changes in biological systems, changes in migration patterns, changes in reproductive systems of different animals, changes in the distribution of animals all over the world, so biological changes. And we've seen changes that really matter also directly to humans, things such as agricultural production and livelihoods. So all over the world, we are seeing that human-induced climate change is causing changes to our physical system, our biological system, and our human system. So what about the future? We've already seen the temperature rise, globally averaged, about 1 degree Celsius. This is a so-called low emissions path. If the world gets serious about climate change and really moves away from fossil fuel and really does transition to a low carbon economy, we could be on this low pathway. It gives us some chance of stabilizing around 2 degrees Celsius. What you notice is actually the land areas warm a little bit more than the oceans, and the high latitudes warm more than the equator. So at least Sri Lanka's lucky that it's near the equator. If, however, we do not get to grips with human-induced climate change and we have a high emissions profile, that is to say we continue to burn fossil fuels, we will see something where the globe on average could warm 5, 6, 7 degrees Celsius. The land areas will warm even more, and the very high latitudes 10 degrees or more. So we have a very, very serious issue if we stay on the high emissions. And to be honest, we're closer to the high emissions profile now than we are the low emissions. It's crucial we try to get here, not here. This shows what can happen to sea level. If we're on the high emissions area, by the end of this century, we could see 0.5 metre to 1 metre. If we're on the low emissions, we'll still see sea level change, but more like 0.2, 0.4 metres. But what we've got to recognise is the system will also become windier, and therefore there'll also be major storm surges. So you can't just plan for the average sea level rise when you build a port infrastructure or sea walls in the coastal areas. You have to allow for storm surges. Also, since this slide was put together, the scientific community has got really worried that the West Antarctic ice sheet is melting quicker than they understand, and Greenland is melting quicker. So if indeed Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheet melt, these projections could be on the low side. Significant adverse effects for any low-lying area. As I said earlier, as you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, some is absorbed by the ocean, you get ocean acidification, it will kill coral reefs, and it adversely affects any shellfish and other fisheries. And so the issue of ocean acidification is a very, very serious one for any island state which has coral reefs or depends to some degree in its economic situation on fisheries. So what's the new normal for Sri Lanka likely to be? As you can see, annual temperatures will clearly go up. Annual rainfall, the key issue is it's going to be less predictable. It doesn't matter if you're in a dry area of Sri Lanka or a wet area of Sri Lanka, the precipitation is going to be more variable. There will be more floods due to heavy precipitation events and more droughts. It sounds ironic, but even in parts of the world which will get more precipitation, they will still get more droughts. And so this is so the management is going to be an incredible management. How do you manage water resources and agriculture when it becomes far less predictable? You have to have the right policies and the right technologies. And also sea level is clearly going to be a challenge all around the coastal areas. This shows you just where there might be some more floods. But as I say, it's both floods and droughts that one has to worry about. So what are some of the projected impacts on Sri Lanka? Very, very similar to many other parts of the world. There will be higher temperatures, as I've said, variable precipitation, more floods, more droughts, more extreme events affecting agriculture and water resources. There will be heavy precipitation, and when you couple it in areas that have been deforested, you'll get soil erosion, you'll get siltation of the reservoirs, your tanks, and landslides. Clearly, sea level rise is going to be a major issue for infrastructure in the coastal area, and also saltwater intrusion will affect water quality in the coastal area and agriculture. I've already mentioned ocean acidification will affect fisheries and coral reefs. And also, changes in climate both temperature and precipitation. Very major adverse effects on biodiversity, on plants, on animals, on the ecosystems themselves. Sri Lanka is really rich in biodiversity. It's a major part of your tourism industry, and fundamentally it's got a lot of endemic species. That means they're unique to Sri Lanka. And so it's in Sri Lanka's best interest to work with the rest of the world to try and limit human-induced climate change, because it will have a very major negative effect here in Sri Lanka. Now, it was also mentioned in the earlier talk, the introduction, that every country in the world, every single country in the world, signed something called the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It was a landmark agreement of every country. The trouble is, climate change, which was recognised by the governments, is a major threat to most of those Sustainable Development Goals. It's a major threat to poverty. Poor people are the most vulnerable to human-induced climate change. Poor people, poor countries. It's a major challenge for agriculture. Agricultural productivity will go down in many parts of the world, if not all, which will threaten food security, and it will threaten hunger, achieving hunger. Healthy lives. Human-induced climate change will affect dengue, malaria, heat stress mortality, cholera, and so again, we need to deal with climate change. Equally, it will affect water and sanitation, adverse effects on what we call a resilient infrastructure. Our cities, due to heat stress mortality, absolutely threatened by significant changes in climate, and clearly all of our oceans and all of our terrestrial biosphere clearly will effectively be threatened. And lastly, on this slide, but not least, peaceful and inclusive societies. The poor are the most vulnerable, and when the natural resources get degraded, it gives you conflict. It gives you conflict within countries and between countries. And so clearly, if a country, any country in the world, wants to achieve these sustainable development goals, they have to recognise that climate change is a major threat to reaching those achievements. So what do I think Sri Lanka should consider? First, it really should have a sustainable development strategy that covers every sector. But it can't do it alone. Government alone can't do it. You need the government to work with the private sector, to work with the NGOs, to work with academia and the public. I would argue there should be a panel put together, chaired by your president. You really need all stakeholders to work together. The first thing is, how sustainable is Sri Lanka today? Is it economically sustainable? Probably not. Is it environmentally sustainable? A real challenge. Is it socially equitable and sustainable? So you have to ask, how sustainable is Sri Lanka today? Then the second question is, what's the vision for Sri Lanka? What does the average person want? Where does the government want to go? Where does the private sector want to go? Where do poor people, rich people? So one needs a vision for Sri Lanka. Then the question is, what's the strategy to meet these 17 sustainable development goals, recognising they're all interrelated? You can't think about agriculture without thinking about water, or without energy. You can't think about health without thinking about water or energy or agriculture. So effectively, how can you have a strategy that recognises the interrelationship between all of these so-called sustainable development? And lastly, no point having a strategy if you don't implement the strategy, and so one needs some regular monitoring. But the key point is, it needs everyone to work together. It can't be top-down by government, it can't be bottom-up by NGOs. Everybody needs to work together to buy into the vision and into the philosophy. So on the first part of the talk, what's the bottom line? There is absolutely no question the Earth's climate is changing, and it's due to us. It's not natural. The magnitude, which I'll now talk about, of future climate change will depend on the actions we take now and in the future. Are we serious about a low-carbon economy? The impacts of climate change are already occurring. You can see them in Sri Lanka, you can see them all over the world. They're mainly negative, there are a few positives, but predominantly negative, and they will only get worse in the future. And even if we limit climate change to 2 degrees Celsius, that's much worse than where we are today. So basically, Sri Lanka, and especially poor people in Sri Lanka, are affected already and will continue. The time for action is now, not only in Sri Lanka, but across the world. These are 3 projects that I've worked on, a couple of them, and we've looked effectively at what does it take to go to a low carbon economy. A lot of the studies look to see where do we need to be in 50 years' time? How do we get to a low carbon economy now? But in particular, this document which I shared for the small island states says, boy, you mustn't just look at 50 years. What do we need to do now? What do we need to do in the next 5 years? What do we need to do in the next 10 years to put us on the right pathway for the next 50 years? So we took a position, and basically the message is going to be simple: energy efficiency and renewable energy. And so the scale is really something the world has never seen. We need a major transition of our energy system, and we also have to remember how to manage our land. We must slow down and stop deforestation, basically. We can and we must act boldly. If we want any hope to get to the Paris Agreement, which every government signed, of trying to get to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, we have to act now. I will tell you in a few minutes, I don't believe we have a hope of staying at 1.5 to 2. But we need to make sure we don't get to 5 or 6. Absolutely critical, basically. We've got to make sure that we manage the costs of mitigation and adaptation, and we can. There is no question. We have to realize there's a lot of people, especially in Sri Lanka, who live on old-fashioned biomass. Everybody in the world deserves modern renewable energy, and that is achievable. So we can supply modern energy to the world and meet the climate goals, basically. We have to recognize it's not just a technological issue. There are major institutional, financial, and political issues that we're going to have to deal with. But the bottom line is our current pathway is not taking us to a 2-degree world. It's taken us to a world, in my opinion, between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius. And that world is not a world that we want. Major challenges to agriculture, major challenges to water resources, major challenges to human health and sea level rise. So this is a world we do not want to see. Our children do want to see. So what do we need to do? Rapidly increase energy efficiency. It doesn't matter whether it's in transportation, buildings, or in industry. There's great opportunities in all areas to increase energy efficiency. We need to deploy renewable energy, and as you've already heard, Sri Lanka has great, and I'll show a slide in a few minutes, great opportunities in renewable energy. It does not need to live on imported coal. Why import coal when you have major natural resources here already? We should put a price on carbon. Carbon actually costs the economy money, and so do some of the other air pollutants. So we should actually put a price on carbon, and that will stimulate the market to move away from a fossil fuel industry to a renewable energy, and it will also stimulate energy efficiency. So if we could put a price on carbon, and many of the countries in the world are seriously thinking about a price on carbon, some actually have a price on carbon, it stimulates the transition to more efficient use of energy and more deployment of renewable energy. Clearly, we need policies to catalyse behaviour change. That's behaviour change in government itself, the private sector, and us as everyday individuals, basically. How do you sort of put a good, sensible policy that we all agree that will help all of us limit our use of carbon energy? And in my opinion, and most of the academic community now, no more coal-fired plants should be built unless they have something called carbon capture and storage. But it's a technology that could be expensive, and it's a technology that is not fully developed. It looks very promising to me, and what that means is you can burn, say, coal to produce electricity, but you have to stop, you have to capture the carbon dioxide before it goes into the atmosphere, and then you have to subduct it or conserve it either in a saline aquifer, a depleted oil well, or a depleted gas well. It is an interesting technology. I think we need to develop it further, but one must not rely on it at the moment. And so, how do we get to a 2-degree world? This is what we need to do. The global emissions, which have been going up and up and up and up, have to start to come down. we need the global emissions to peak by 2020. We need to reduce globally somewhere between 35 and 75% by 2050, and I would say it's really 50% to 75% globally by 2050, a major reduction. And in the end, by the second half of the century, we might need zero or negative emissions. I'm personally very sceptical about achieving this, very sceptical about achieving this. The trouble is, these are, what if we don't go to this very low carbon economy? What if we have a bit of fossil fuel, a bit more, and a lot more? We're probably on a pathway between these two, which says to me we're on a pathway of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, potentially even worse. So where are the fossil fuels coming from? The picture is changing significantly. I'm just showing 4 of the top emitters. And what you can see is the United States, which is this one, has always been a major emitter. The next one is the European Union, always a major emitter. India coming up fast. China now has twice the emissions of even the United States. In the last 20 years, there has been a monumental increase in emissions from China. But the next thing is per capita. Still the greediest country in the world is mine, the United States. Then you get Europe. And so, but what you now see already is China has already, even with 1 billion people without access to modern energy, 1 billion people without access to, per capita, China is now equal to the European Union. India is down here at about 1.7, and Sri Lanka is even half of India. It's crucial that Sri Lanka gets modern renewable energy for everybody. Absolutely essential. The challenge is how to get it. And this shows how efficient our industries in producing economic output per unit of carbon dioxide. And as you can see, all countries in the world are improving their efficiency. That means to say they're not relying on fossil fuel energy as much today as they did 30, 40 years ago. China has increased drastically, but it's still relatively inefficient compared to the US, Japan, European Union. So a crucial issue is how to make industry efficient. So they're 3 of the key things. So what did the Paris Agreement say? What did 190 countries agree? Limit the climate change to no more than 2 degrees relative to pre-industrial 1850, but even aspire to 1.5. We need to peak our emissions globally as soon as possible. Each country should have a national plan. It's recognised we should not just mitigate, we must adapt, as I've already said. The developed world has promised significant funds to help developing countries, $100 billion per year for both mitigation and adaptation. I don't know where this money's coming from, but they've promised it. And so from a Sri Lankan perspective, and if you say, well, it's going to cost money to transition to a low carbon economy, it's going to cost money to adapt, there are many, many international funds now that if Sri Lanka is serious about going to a low carbon economy, doing really good adaptation across all the sectors, there are going to be financial resources available. So this comes from the United Nations UNEP. This shows if we do nothing, this is what would happen. Our emissions will just continue to go up and up and up from today to here. To be on a low carbon pathway, to be this 2 degrees Celsius, they need to do this. So the question is, what did the Paris pledges show? Well, this is just expanding it. In other words, this is business as usual, major climate change. This is where we need to go over the next decade or so. Governments around the world put pledges in, and they pledge to reduce their emissions relative to their baseline or their business. And so, yes, relative to what we would have done without Paris, they've promised It will see if they keep their promises, promise to reduce the emissions. But it only takes us to here. We need to be down here. So in other words, the Paris pledges, if governments implement them, and that's a big if governments implement them, will help to reduce the projection of climate change, but nowhere near enough. In other words, we need to do far more than the Paris pledges. And we end up with someone now, a new president of the United States, that still thinks that climate change is a hoax. Clearly living in cuckoo land, to be quite honest. And that's being kind to the guy. So clearly, we need the world, including the US, to take this issue seriously. But there are some good opportunities, as I'll talk about. So that's the gap that we have to fill. So the bottom line of the Paris Agreement, a very important first step. I strongly applaud it, basically. But we will not achieve the 2-degree target with the current pledges. We need doubling or tripling of effort. The 2-degree target will be met in a paper I wrote by 2050, where we really push hard on end-use efficiency. And we all agree we can be much more efficient in our use of energy. And it's cost-effective. It really is. So the first thing is, let's use our energy more efficiently. The second thing is, we also need far more renewable energy, wind, solar, and where appropriate, modern biomass, plantation biomass. And if we are going to use coal, oil and gas, we should use it with this technique, which is not currently easily available, carbon capture and storage. So, on the induced efficiency, lots of options basically. Air conditioning, process heat, lighting, motors, home appliances, building. Every one of them has real potential. And it comes with significant economic benefits to the country. But we also have to deal with the transportation sector. More efficient vehicles, mass transportation, etc. And I have to say, the traffic in Colombo is really rather frightening, basically. So how you get an efficient mass transportation system when they're building high-rises everywhere and the roads are already congested is a major challenge for the government, clearly. What this shows is the cost of renewable energy is really coming down, and now wind and solar are relatively competitive to coal. So why use coal, which you have to import from abroad, when basically the costs... Now, the old argument was you can't use renewable energy like wind and solar, they're intermittent. The sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. But we really now have some very, very good storage facilities, storage capability at a very reasonable economic price. So renewable energy is now viable when you couple it in with energy storage. It's a very, very different situation to what we had even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, when solar and wind were just not competitive with gas and coal. Now they're competitive. Gas in many countries is still the cheapest, but clearly coal really is not the way to go. Huge investments in renewable energy, both in developed and in developing countries. I mean, like several $100 billion a year, and some of the money, this is just in renewable. An equal amount of money is being spent in the world on end-use efficiency. So if we're spending around $250 billion a year on renewables, you can double that on modern energy. The other half go into energy efficiency. And actually, if you look at global capacity, a huge amount of new capacity increasing over time is wind and solar. It really is starting to penetrate. Even China, who use a lot of fossil fuel for their economic growth, and India have really captured the solar market and the wind market. And both of these are very, very viable, as one will see in Sri Lanka, basically. This actually just is a map. What I should also say is this presentation will be put on a website. So if anyone ever wants to look at this presentation, it will be on the website, because some of this is probably not easy to read, and I apologize for that, basically. But the cost of renewable energy, especially this one is solar, is really coming down. And one of the cheapest countries in the world for solar is actually India, way below the global average. So real opportunities, basically. This is the current situation in Sri Lanka, which you know better than me. This is biomass, but it's not modern biomass. It really is just inefficient use of biomass for heating, etc. There clearly is some petroleum, some coal, and some renewable energy. So that's the current situation. Clearly, as Sri Lanka gets richer, they'll want to move away from that, what I call this unsustainable biomass here, to some form of modern energy. Should it come from renewable or coal? This is indeed a policy statement which is superb by the government, absolutely. Basically, you need to meet basic energy needs through renewable energy, and you heard that also in the opening talk, basically. We need to reduce the emissions in Sri Lanka genuinely by 4% in 2030 relative to 2010. When I read the current plan, it looks like it's a 4% reduction against an increase in emissions. So one has to look at this very carefully. But basically, this is a really good policy statement. And this is totally and utterly inconsistent with that policy statement. This says that most of the future will actually be about a 5-fold increase in the use of coal by the Central Electricity Board. This is not the way to go. If one is serious about the Paris Pledge, if one's serious about the policy of the government, this should not occur. There is an increase in renewable energy, but this increase in coal is absolutely, in my opinion, absurd, especially when the coal has to be imported. So really, this is not a vision, in my opinion, for Sri Lanka. Very easy for someone outside the country to say, but really, and why don't you need it? Very straightforward. You have superb renewable energy resources, basically. You have wind. So this is the energy demand of Sri Lanka today. The potential for wind far exceeds this, as you can see, basically. Solar can get close to it. Modern biomass can contribute. So then the question is, well, where does Sri Lanka want to be in 2030? What's the energy demand? And CEB came up with this number here. But it didn't allow for the fact that you can actually improve your efficient use of energy. So this is actually too high. The real number is somewhere down here. The basic message is Sri Lanka can meet its basic energy needs, modern energy for everybody, with wind energy, solar energy, and some biomass energy. There's also some micro hydro. Some of it's more sustainable than others. One does not need to rely on coal. End-use efficiency and modern renewable energy. People say, my God, it's going to cost a lot of money to actually go to a low-carbon economy. And actually, the economists would agree that by 2100, this is a global number, 450 sort of puts you on a pathway to 2 degrees Celsius. So say, to meet a 2 degrees Celsius world, it could cost between 3 and 11% of GDP. Central number about 5. Boy, that sounds a lot. 5% loss of GDP. But between now and the year 2100, the world GDP should go up 300% to 900%. So to lose 5% in 300 or 5% in 900 is almost nothing. It really is a very, very small penalty. And so if you've got a GDP that grows at 2%, typical of a Western country, or 4, 5 or 6%, more typical of a developing country, and say instead of 6%, which China is aiming for again this year, it wouldn't be 6%, it would be 5.94, 0.06 less. Bottom line is very straightforward. The costs of mitigation are less than the cost of adaptation, and it avoids a lot of social disruption, and also there are other benefits. When you burn coal, you end up with urban smog. You end up with regional air pollution. There are major health effects of urban pollution. And so there are other health benefits which are also economic benefits. There is no question. The best strategy is to mitigate and adapt. It's not one or the other, it is indeed both. So what are the challenges? These don't show everything. The real challenge is, as I've said it twice already, government working with the private sector, working with the NGOs and academia, need to have a vision of how to adapt, and they need to work together. Government can facilitate the private sector, but the private sector is ahead of the game in many. So of the global 100 companies, most of them recognise the problem is now. This isn't an issue for 20 years' time or 30 years' time. This is an issue now. They recognise that climate change is affecting their business. And most of them expect more high costs or interruptions. They actually see that some of their production capacity might be affected. They recognise that there might be increased operational costs. There may be an inability to do business even, and increased capital costs. A number of different reasons. But some of the private sector companies recognise this is a real challenge. And some are already taking preemptive action, basically. They're integrating the issue of climate change into their risk management plans. They recognise climate change is a risk to their business. So they're thinking through, how can I incorporate the issue of climate change into my business plan, basically. They're also conducting very specific environmental assessments. How will the environment change affect my business? How will climate be affect my business? What about water, basically? And so quite clearly here, business is starting to recognise they need to start to adapt. They can be helped significantly with good government policies. There are really major opportunities. It should not only be seen as a challenge, and yes, it is a challenge. I would be the last one to say this is not a challenge. But there really are some opportunities, especially for the exporters, basically. In future, the climate regimes will become more demanding, almost certainly. So private sector and government should get ahead of the curve. Trade policies may actually be connected to carbon intensity. In other words, some countries may not want to import goods if they come from a country with a high carbon footprint, basically. And some consumers might also take an activist position and say, look, we don't want climate change. We don't want to import or use something that had a heavy climate footprint. And this has happened in the past. The chemical agreement on REACH, those businesses that got ahead and really helped the industries become clean with respect to chemicals really benefited with the so-called European Union REACH thing. Also, Nike in other countries, they were making their shoes in Bangladesh, in China, with no human rights at all. Suddenly, the consumer in America, in Europe said, this is unacceptable. We can't have child labour. It drastically changed the way that Nike and other footwear companies sort of got their products from. So basically, private sector, especially the exporters, need to get ahead of the game. So what's the conclusion? I've already said this. Sri Lanka is vulnerable. It's already vulnerable. It will become even more vulnerable, even with mitigation. Even if we can make a 2-degree world, that's still going to cause problems on water, problems on agriculture, sea level rise, human health issues such as dengue and malaria. And so clearly there is a need to adapt and adapt now. So in other words, you're having a current drought. Has one got the right policies in place that when you do get a drought, you can survive the drought? And that's what's really needed, is to be proactive and get ahead of the game. One can need a low carbon strategy. And if you have one, it can be cost effective on its own with renewable energy and energy efficiency, but one also can get money from the International Climate Fund. So even when effectively end-use efficiency is cost effective, there's some initial capital costs. This is where you can go to the International Climate Funds, basically. As I've already said, lots of opportunities for efficiency, lots of opportunities for renewable energy. I would argue, do not use more coal. This is not the way to go. You have to import it. That's also expensive for your currency, basically. Need to reduce deforestation and even reforest. Good for climate, good for biodiversity, good for tourism. Stops landslides, stops siltation of lakes and rivers. There is absolutely no contradiction. Some people say, you can't have economic growth and environmental protection. Absolute rubbish. The best way to protect the environment was a strong economy, and the best way to get a strong economy is good environmental protection. The old philosophy of pollute now and clean up later is completely discredited, basically. It's not the way to go. Yes, that's how we developed in America. It's how we developed in Europe. We made major mistakes, basically. We know far more now. We've got better technologies. We know what sort of policies can work. They have to be relevant for the country. They should be not top down from the rich countries. Sri Lanka itself has to decide what policies, what vision is in its best interest, basically. And yes, if there are costs, there are funds that you can go to, basically. And I really do suggest that having a really good sustainable development strategy, which will cover every sector, it will cover agriculture, water, energy, it will bring in gender issues, sustainable production, it'll bring in biodiversity, it'll bring in climate change, it'll bring in all health, all the issues that you care about, basically. So in one sustainable development strategy, you already cover a strategy for climate, a strategy for biodiversity, a strategy for food security, water security, energy security, human health, gender, equity between people. So the basic answer is very simple. Time is act now. There are lots of opportunities and they're cost effective. Thank you very much.